What's up, athletes? In today's video, you're gonna learn how to generate that massive, heavy topspin on your forehand in 3 simple steps. Let's go. Step 1 is all in the backswing. If you look at every top modern ATP forehand, the heaviest forehands in the world, you'll see that the racket tip is pointing somewhere toward the right side of their body. Now what this position does is it creates more space for the racket to be able to flip back during their acceleration, gaining more racket head speed and ultimately producing more spin. In contrast, you'll see that a lot of club players, junior players, and even WTA players are going to point their racket tip somewhere down toward the ground or toward the left of their body. And this isn't necessarily wrong, but it severely limits the amount of spin that they can produce. You see, when your racket tip is to the right of your body, as you accelerate and the racket flips back, this puts a stretch on your forearm and, more importantly, shoulder muscles that are responsible for internally rotating your racket back over to create that spin. And that's why if you take most modern ATP forehands and you look at their forehand from 12 o'clock, which would be directly in front of them, to 6 o'clock, which would be directly behind them, you'll see that their racket tip is pointing somewhere between 3 o'clock and 5:30. So take a look at these players with the next gen forehand, like Jack Sock or Nick Kyrgios, and you'll see their racket tip is pointing more toward 3 o'clock. What this does is it gives them even more space than a traditional forehand to flip back, creating more stretch and creating even more spin. If you go out onto the court and you have this internal rotation in your shoulder here, you'll immediately notice more spin on your forehand. An important note though is that they're not taking their entire arm toward the side of their body. If you look at their forehand from the side view, there's a massive amount of space between their elbow and their torso. And instead, they're orienting the racket tip to the side through a motion called internal shoulder rotation. So their arm is far away from their body, and from there, they turn their arm until the knuckles are pointing somewhat toward the sky. And the result is one of the heaviest, most powerful forehands in the world. If you want us to make a more in-depth video on the next gen forehand, be sure to let us know in the comments below. Now, the one caveat to this forehand is that it does take more time to prep, and because of the amount of space that it takes for the racket to flip back, it can be harder to time, especially when you're dealing with faster paced balls. So take a look at players like Federer or Djokovic, who like to take the ball early, stand on the baseline, and play a more faster paced game of tennis. And you'll see that their racket tip is pointing more toward that 4:30 to 5:30 range. And that's where I recommend that you start, in this moderate zone where your racket tip is somewhere in between the side and the back of the fence. Step 2 is all about achieving the dynamic, fluid flip of your racket during your acceleration. As players push the ground and rotate their hips, this propels their shoulders to rotate in, and it also propels their arm to move forward. And all of this force is ultimately applied to the back of their grip shaft. So if I set my racket out to the side and I hold the throw of the racket with my 2 fingers and I apply a force to the back of the grip shaft, here's what happens. So this flip is happening because of the natural inertia of your racket head. And combined with the inertia of your racket head, this force from your hips causes your racket to ultimately flip back, rotating your wrist and hitting arm into that lagged position. And at the same time, your wrist should naturally move into an extended and radially deviated position. In other words, if you keep your hitting arm relaxed with the racket tip to the right side of your body and then rotate your body into the net, you're going to naturally achieve this fluid flip of your racket. Unfortunately, I see so many players struggling to develop their modern ATP forehand because of one of the most common traps when you're trying to develop your technique, which is forcing this wrist lag motion. And Day and I personally struggled with this for years when we were trying to develop our forehands. We would try to set the racket to the side in this very rigid and technical manner. Number one, and then we'd go number two. We would record ourselves side by side with Federer, and we'd try to artificially manufacture the same exact motions. And because we didn't understand the science that went behind the technique, we ended up only copying the surface level techniques, misconstruing the techniques, ultimately leading Day to a bad wrist injury. Now, when I say keep your arm relaxed, I don't mean just let it happen naturally. Like, that's one of the other common pet peeve instructions that I hear is, you know, let it happen naturally. I'm like, no, it's not intuitive. We do have an excellent drill for you to be able to practice feeling this fluid, natural flip while staying relaxed. Start by placing your racket tip at about 430 to 530 with your racket tip up and to the right side of your body. From here, I want you to bounce your racket head slightly. And what you'll immediately feel is the position of your racket head. If your racket is pointing down or if it's to the left of your body, you'll immediately know. And just keep bouncing this racket head. And the second benefit of this is that you're gonna force your arm to stay relaxed. Now, continuing to bounce, I want you to try to drop the ball and keep this feeling of the racket bouncing. Don't tense up. And then slowly, when you're ready, just start to turn your hips in and feel the natural flip. We're not hitting the ball yet. Just bounce the ball, bounce, bounce, and you're gonna turn your hips in to feel the natural flip. And finally, when you're comfortable, I want you to bounce the racket in your hand, drop the ball, turn your hips in, and feel that natural flip and acceleration of your racket head. All right, step number 3 is the roll, AKA the windshield wiper motion. Once players reach the full flip of the racket, they're gonna rotate the racket around in front of their body, creating the shape of a half circle through contact. And this dynamic flip in subsequent internal rotation of the racket is the key that top pros use to generate tons of spin without losing power. So one of the most common mistakes I see players, especially at the junior and club level, making is focusing on the low to high swing. And you'll see a lot of coaches drilling this into their students as well. And the problem necessarily isn't the racket going from low to high, but more in the way that this is achieved. Logically, low to high makes sense because as the racket travels up, it creates a frictional force on the ball, and that creates a subsequent spin. The problem, though, is if you break the anatomy down into its basic muscles, you'll see that this shoulder flexion motion is using pretty weak muscles like your frontal deltoid. If you look at the top ATP forehands, you'll see that they're using more of a motion called internal shoulder rotation, which unlocks way bigger muscles like your pec major and your lats. So watch what happens when I place my hand further in front of my body so that I have this nice spacing at contact. Now watch what happens as I roll my hand can stay completely still, and simply by rotating my racket over from my shoulder and my forearm, I can drive the racket head up. And that's what you see top pros using to create that massive spin. The second benefit is that because you're not focusing on brushing up or swinging up, you can actually pull your hand across your body for power and simultaneously roll, creating both power and spin, which is what's the key to getting that heavy ball. So how can you get the same windshield wiper effect? The most common roadblock that I see players face is in the contact point. You see, when your contact is placed not in front of you, but when you're jammed and you're tight, and a lot of the times if you're making contact to the side of your body, you end up getting rid of this natural angle in your racket and your forearm. You could actually try this with me if you have a racket. Place your contact to the side of your body and in this uncomfortable jam position. And I want you to try to use the motion of internal shoulder rotation. And what you'll notice is that the racket is no longer being driven upward from this motion. But if you place your contact further away from you With your arm extended, even if it's slightly bent, you'll notice that this natural internal rotation is much more intuitive, and thus spin becomes much easier to generate. And that's the key to getting rid of that tight, dragging, arming feeling on your forehand, and instead feeling a more fluid and effortless swing that allows you to swing out with all the confidence you need. So fix your contact and you'll get massive topspin. One of the simplest ways to start building the correct contact is through simple isolation. So for this drill, I want you to start in the service box and start in your contact point, and simply drop a ball and focus on feeling the topspin you get from internally rotating your shoulder and your forearm. So I want you to start in the service box from your contact point. And you don't need a ball yet. You're simply going to rotate your racket over without moving your hand. And what I want you to see is that your racket strings are continuing to face the net throughout your entire motion. Now from here, you're going to drop a ball in front of you and simply focus on getting the same rolling motion to create spin on the ball. Now, a great tool I recommend using here is the Topspin Pro, because it'll give you instant feedback as to how much spin you're able to produce and whether you're flexing your wrist forward too much as you hit. We made an entire tutorial on the Topspin Pro, and you can access that video right in the description below if you're interested. Now, when you're comfortable with this motion, you can start to add in the forward extension of your arm by simply focusing on pulling your hand across your body. And you'll notice that this is where your wrist will naturally start to release forward, but you want to do that. But the key is that you don't want this to happen prematurely so as to jam yourself and position your contact too far to your side. So making sure your contact's still in front of you, you pull your hand across, and that's where you can feel the natural release of your wrist as you simultaneously rotate the racket over from your shoulder and your forearm. And lastly, you can take this out into your real rallies and your real matches, and hopefully you start to see more spin on your forehand. All right, athletes, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, be sure to leave us a like, because it helps us really grow the channel, and we're really trying to step up our content to the next level. So we'd really appreciate it if you shared it with more players that you feel like it could help. And as always, athletes, until next time, go out and train hard. I will see you in the next video.